get started? Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, I can hear myself. Good. Before we get started, can somebody tell me what this graphic means? What are we trying to convey here? The reality. Okay. So if you remember a few years ago, Steve Jobs made the statement that Flash was a resource hog and had stability issues. He was talking about on the desktop specifically, but Adobe found that that perception carried over onto the Android device as well, on the handsets. So in this particular, getting a bit of an echo, is it because this microphone's? Okay. In this particular session, we're going to talk about a series of reports and testing that my company did, where we looked at some of the challenges and opportunities for video playback, as well as performance and battery impact issues on Android devices. And we did it in a series of 2 phases. So the first phase was a report that looked at performance versus penalty. And by the way, at the very end of this, you can certainly take notes, but at the very end of this, I have a link to the site that you can go to download the reports. The reports are about 25 pages each. They have a number of different tables, as well as the explanations as to the things that we found. So anyway, let's first talk about the perception. The perception was that Flash Player sucks, and it literally sucks on mobile devices because it tends to, the perception was that it sucked battery, sucked memory, and even sucked at performing basic tasks like graphics rendering. The reality, after doing the test, is a little more complicated than that. But the big question that I had as I started looking into this, trying to decide whether I was going to write an article for streaming media or whether I was going to actually try to do a bigger report, was how did we get to the point where Flash Player was the first culprit that whenever you read a review, the review would say Flash Player is horrible on this particular device, versus other things like data network connectivity, GPS, or even the integral applications. And then more importantly, as any time you write an article, you want to make sure, is this true or is it just a perception? The reason that it was important to kind of figure this out was the fact that Android growth has been very dramatic. We did the first set of tests in January 2011, so the numbers that we looked at for growth were from late 2010. And you can see here on the screen that smartphone shipments had an 87% increase year over year to 101 million units, and that for the first time at the end of 2010, PC sales were actually lower than smartphone sales. So 92 million units at a 3% growth rate for PCs versus 101 million units for an 87% increase over that same period. And then at least in the US, at the end of 2010, almost 29% of the smartphones sold in the US were based on Android, which was a huge jump in a single quarter of 7.3% of the market share. Part of that was taken from RIM, part of that was taken from some of the other companies. But at the end of the day, what it meant was that Android-based handset shipments surpassed those of iPhone devices because iPhone devices had 25% of the market. So the reasoning on this was when the iOS devices were dominant and didn't have Flash, there really wasn't a discussion. But as the market share shifted, it became a very serious discussion to take a look at Android and the implications of Flash on it. So the challenge was to determine whether the stability and performance issues that Steve Jobs had talked about were actually applicable to the handset. I went to Adobe, asked them to provide some publicly available data on tests that they'd done, and they said that they didn't really have a whole lot that they could put out into the marketplace, not because they hadn't done the testing, and they certainly had done the testing, but because of the fact that they had been using things that they wouldn't necessarily have the rights to put out into the market in terms of the sites and content that someone could use to replicate their tests. We also asked that, since they said they were open to third-party testing, and we said we would do a methodology, we asked that we get an instrument version of 10.1 that would give us frames per second performance, memory, and that type of thing. And if any of you have gone to an Adobe Max conference, they'll actually use that kind of a flash player on stage so that you can see what the performance is. It was very helpful in terms of being able to determine exactly what was happening. So just very quickly on the methodology, this is laid out in multiple pages in the report. We took 6 Android handsets. We looked at video playback and animation rendering. We had the instrumented flash build. We found publicly available content so that you could replicate it yourself if you wanted to test it. And then we looked at what the battery impacts were as well as the trade-offs on performance. And just quickly, you can take a look at the devices we used to test. You'll notice we had similar processors for two devices, would each have similar processor. Fairly close in terms of testing the OS version. WebKit was consistent, except for if you look at the second to the last line, Nexus S actually had a newer version of the operating system, a newer version of WebKit, and a newer version of the YouTube player, and that caused a lot of problems. And we'll get to that in a couple minutes. The public sites that we chose, we had static sites like Drudge Report, Google, so we were looking at sites that were very basic in terms of having a white background, some black text, or just a little bit of text, and then one like Drudge Report that would have a single Flash Swift that would be served versus Google that had nothing. And then some very immersive sites like Ekadazoo, and then gaming. And this was actually interesting. So we had these 6 devices, and part of the testing was fill the battery all the way up, and then play games on it until the battery died. And some of the people that I hired that were 20 to 30 sort of liked it. There was one 18-year-old who absolutely loved it. He was like, I'm getting paid to play video games. But some of the games that we played in this round, they found really boring because they mastered them, and so the game lasted 5 minutes instead of 2 hours. So in the next round, we actually got a more robust game to play. I actually told my son that maybe he could actually aspire to get paid to play video games, and at 14, he thinks that's a really cool possibility. All right, so overall findings in our first round. When there are multiple applications running, if the device is on the mobile voice or data network, the presence of Flash Player appeared to have little or no impact. What we mean by that specific thing is that, as it mentions on the next line, 3G, GPS, and the other radios in the device minus Wi-Fi tend to consume a significant amount of power. If we turned off GPS, we could get 15% of our battery life or higher back. If we turned off the GSM, we'd get 35% of the battery back. Of course, that's not really practical. You're not going to turn off GSM. But with GPS actually consumed much more battery than Flash did, even when Flash was running full bore. So let's take a look real quick at one of the examples of something that we did. This is an animation rendering. And it's actually themaninblue.com/experiment/animation benchmark. The last portion of the URL would either be Canvas, Flash, SVG, or HTML. You can go to the site and it actually will play this content back on a mobile device, whether a handset or a tablet, or your computer. And again, at the bottom, it will show you the frame rate. So what we would do is run it for 5 minutes, get the average frame rate, and then do our comparisons, and then would take a look at the battery impact as we let it then run out for X number of hours. What we found was that over a 3-hour test period, which was about the average for all those handsets, if we used it to play these, to play the Flash version of it, using the animation running constantly, that there's only about 10 minutes difference between Flash versus HTML. But what was fascinating is if you look at the next line, Flash Player 10.1 actually performed 350% better than HTML. So the average frames on the particle test for HTML were 4 to 7 frames a second, so moving relatively slowly across the screen, versus 13 to 25 for Flash, and that's non-optimized for hardware, that's just pure software. So significant performance differences. What that means in terms of things like gaming is if you are gaming, do you want something where it stutters across the screen, or do you want something that moves very smoothly? And then the bigger question is, do you mind losing 10 minutes and 3 hours to get that very smooth motion versus the stuttering? Personally, to me, I'd rather have the smooth motion because the likelihood is I'm not going to be so concerned that I lose that 10 minutes. You know, unless I'm, I don't know, in the middle of Nigeria like I was last week and I only get battery charge once a day. Now, I talked about the Drudge site with one Flash ad versus Google with no Flash ads. At the bottom here, you can see in the second column that that's the Drudge site with one Flash ad that's served up constantly. And you'll notice that there's not a significant difference with the Galaxy S and the Nexus S. You'll notice that on the Droid Incredible and the HTC Evo, there was a fairly significant difference on those, about roughly 20%. Based on the test, we kind of account that for two things. One, the Drudge site every 3 minutes refreshes itself, and so it was constantly, not constantly, but it was more frequently calling information, where the Google site just sits and waits for you to do something. One thing that we found, and I'll address this a bit later, but one thing we found was that just turning on the Google page and leaving it there, we could drain the battery 40% faster than if we went to a site that had a black background. So the white pixels are very, very expensive, and I don't know why, with Google being so eco-conscious, I don't know why they've not gone to something with a darker background, because it had significant pixel expense. On the video playback side, in this first round with 10.1, we had a video file that we played both in browser with the underlying YouTube service as well as in the YouTube app. And you'll notice that in two instances, it played better in it played longer in the browser. In two instances, it played longer in the YouTube app. So this was, we felt this was inconsistent. We needed to understand the anomalies, and so in the second round of testing, we had addressed this. Interestingly, one of the devices you don't see on this list is the Nexus S. The Nexus S would actually not play the YouTube content. And we thought that was an anomaly. We found in the second test, it also would not play the YouTube content. So there's something, and as I'll get to it, there are several things it wouldn't do, which really concern me because it's the flagship device for Google. And then one of the questions we had as we got to the end of this is, what about mimicking desktop video playback? Because on these devices we were playing the mobile versions, and we said, okay, if we really want to tax the device, what happens if we tax it by saying, give me the desktop version as opposed to the mobile version? Any questions on that first phase? I'll open it up for just a couple minutes for questions. Okay. All right. So now, the next phase that we did, we wanted to rerun some of those tests, but we also wanted to look at kind of consistency of experience. And by consistency of experience, what we mean is that one thing we found in the first round of tests was that there were so many versions of the Android operating system and so many versions of the underlying services or basic applications that come with an Android device that we found the usability kind of stressful, because every single device had buttons in a different place, had the way to get to different parts of the browser or the app. And then we found that they behave differently. So what we decided was to take a look at if we did it in native apps versus doing it in Flash, what kind of consistency would we have and what kind of performance would we have? So we settled on two versions of the OS, 2.3, and happened to do this test right around the time that 3.0 was released, or Honeycomb. And then two versions of the Flash player, 10.2, which was a pre-Honeycomb release, and 10.3, which was just after Honeycomb. But we only used 10.3 on the Motorola Zoom tablet because that was the only device in the market that we could get our hands on that actually had Honeycomb at that point. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about is we ran into some interesting problems with Honeycomb right off the bat. All right, so going back to the fuss, why is it a big deal? Within 3 months' time, we saw a significant jump in the number of smartphones that were based on Android. I think I mentioned before that in Q4 of 2010, it was 28.7%. In Q1, at the end of Q1 2011, in the US, it had jumped to 33%. So Android was continuing to make the climb, continuing to be more relevant. And then across the board, handsets being sold worldwide, if you go back to the PC numbers at 3% growth, overall handsets jumped 19%, and of course the smartphone handsets had jumped almost to 87%. Long and short is flash-equipped smartphones now outnumber iOS handsets, giving Adobe the potential to dominate media delivery if the Flash player and Adobe Integrated Runtime Solutions could offer a consistent experience. So we wanted to build on the initial report, and as I mentioned, we used 10.2, 10.3, and then the OS was 2.3, 3.01, and 3.1. For the video portions of this, we used two H.264 video clips. One was this White House briefing that's listed as the first one. That's the same clip that we used in the first test, and we actually had some different devices in this, but we had a baseline device that we used across both tests. And then, because the Nexus S was having trouble, we actually gave it an alternate YouTube file to play just so we could try to get some numbers against it. And then we used an open source movie called Sita Sings the Blues. It's actually based on an Indian religious legend, and the file was open source. We could actually put it into our server, and one of the things that we told Adobe was that we were going to use Wowza Media Server, not Flash Media Server. The reason we did that was not because we didn't think Flash Media Server would work, but because we felt that Wowza Media Server would give us a consistent experience that somebody could replicate by paying $995 US versus paying $49.95 US for Flash Media Server. And so we used that to actually serve up both RTSP, which was is a base level for all the services on Android devices, and then RTMP for within Flash. You can see here the devices that we used in this. The two NVIDIA devices are the top one, which is the Atrix, which was a mobile handset. And the Atrix is a US name. I can't remember what the device is called elsewhere in the world. And then, of course, the Motorola Zoom. So what you had is a tablet and a handset that both had the exact same processor in it. And it was fun to play with that because it's almost like getting a laptop that has a dual quad core, in a small device versus having it on a desktop. And then on the Zoom, at the bottom, I list out the fact that we tested it with two different versions of the operating system, 3.0, 3.1, and then two versions of the Flash player, one that was 10.2 and 10.3. And because we updated the OS, the browser WebKit the WebKit browser also updated. So what did we find? We found that because of all the different versions of the operating system and the different services underlying, that there was a great deal of fragmentation in terms of the results. And even beyond that, as we start looking at the market and looking at the different delivery options, we see that there are fragmentations in 3 separate areas. I mention these only because of the fact that while we're talking specifically about Android here, we can't ignore the fact that when we talk about fragmentation and transport, M2TS, which is the basis for HLS on the Apple iOS devices, is out there in a very significant way, although that it's a bit of a bastardized version of MPEG-2 transport stream. And then this fragmentation in operating systems, the forking of Android. When Android's put out, of course it's put out completely open source, so you can modify it in any way that you want to, and what you find is that every single handset manufacturer not only modifies it once for, you'd think they'd modify it once for all their devices, but they modify it for every single device. So it's different versions of the stack, different versions of the YouTube player, some of the underlying pieces. I mentioned, I mentioned the baseline of using the Google site. Here, because we had different devices, we had to go back and re-baseline. This slide shows the difference not between using Flash and HTML for animation, but between using a baseline site like Google and using HTML animation. Meaning that if you think that, from a practical standpoint, if you think that HTML5 video is going to solve problems in terms of performance, it may solve some things over time, but ultimately you're still seeing the device pull down a significant amount of battery for the performance that you get out of it. And in these instances, you can see that we're talking 30% to 50% difference just applying an animation to run. This is battery life over the life of the battery. Now, what about taking that and saying what's the difference between HTML and Flash? And again, we're talking here versions 10.2 and 10.3 of Flash Player. You can see on the top we have HTML, and HTML was doing a bit better with some of the more updated versions of Android. So we were getting 6 to almost 10 frames per second. But if you look at the Flash performance, you can see that that also increased, where we had about a 350% performance difference before. Here in some instances, and I'll talk about why it's different, but here in some instances we're up into the 500 to 600, almost 700% performance benefit. And if you take that and then come down here to the lower slide, you say, okay, if I'm playing the animation in HTML, here's the time that it takes for the battery to drain at 6 to 10 or 7 to 10 frames per second. Here's what it takes for the battery to drain if I'm using Flash, running from 21 frames a second up to 64 frames a second. So differences in minutes. Here we're seeing about a 21% difference, all the way down to only a roughly 3% difference, but obviously seeing significant frame rate increases on that. And the reason we did these tests, we also did video tests, but the reason we did these tests is there aren't really good HTML5 video examples out there that you can consistently work through. So we tried to find something that had an HTML JavaScript implementation as well as a Flash implementation, and just use these to run the machines fairly hard. So another part of the findings was we found that we could get a more consistent media consumption experience on using Flash Player than we could if we just used the built-in services, and I'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. Contemplated a better frame rate, had a minimal battery impact, but yielded significant performance gains. And then the last bullet is very important, and this is one of the reasons why you're hearing Adobe talk about Air quite a bit, especially Air 3. You notice that it's this exact same physical device with the Zoom using either 3.0 or 3.1 for the operating system, and then using 10.2 and 10.3 on the Flash Player. What we found was that we could get a 10% performance gain just by changing the OS and the version of the Flash Player. So it was very important to make sure that we had the proper combination, and we ran tests multiple times just to make sure that that wasn't an anomaly. I mentioned before that the Nexus S had trouble in the first test. It also had trouble in the second test playing the mobile versions of the YouTube clip, either in the YouTube app or in the web browser. And we chalked that up to the fact that perhaps because it was a newer version of the YouTube app and there may have been some bugs, but we really think that was a significant finding. But then we found that if we loaded Flash on and forced it into the desktop mode, that it would actually play the content fine. So we knew that what we had was a problem with the underlying operating system and the underlying services. Even more interestingly, when we pushed out RTSP content to each of the 6 devices without the Flash Player on the device, so that we made sure that the Flash Player wasn't taking over, half of the devices wouldn't play the RTSP content at all. Actually, I'm sorry, one of them wouldn't play it at all. 2 of them would play about 3 minutes and then freeze. And we were serving to every single device at the same time, so we knew that there wasn't a problem with the server, we knew there wasn't a problem with the file, we knew there wasn't a problem with the transport. But again, when we threw Flash Player on there with RTMP, it played fine. So going to this consistency of experience, what we found was putting Flash Player on the device gave a consistent experience across all of the devices, where with the underlying services, native services, we couldn't guarantee that we'd get that. In terms of the decodes, and this is the RTMP specifically being served up from Wowza, we also wanted to look at what were the impacts of hardware acceleration versus software acceleration. If you look to the far right, you'll see that 3 of the devices had hardware acceleration, and that those 3 devices, which were the Galaxy S, the Zoom, and the Atrix, they were all able to achieve at least 100% of the target playback. So the CETA movie was 23.98 frames per second, the typical US playback, and those devices were able to get to it without any problem. The other 3 devices didn't have hardware acceleration, and you notice that their playback ranged from roughly half the frames to roughly 3/4 of the frame. So again, if you're watching a movie and you don't have hardware acceleration on the device, there's a potential that you won't actually get to the full number of frames. Then we took a look and said, okay, fine, across that whole scenario, what are the battery impacts? And this is probably the most important gauge for us, which was to say if we took the YouTube mobile clip that we had used before and baselined that on these 3 devices that have hardware acceleration, we would see 6 hours, you can see the listing, say, for the Atrix. The YouTube mobile without Flash would not be using hardware acceleration, so that's basically what it would be if it were playing back with fewer frames per second than full frame rate, but also with the ability to maximize the battery life. If we threw RTMP in there, where hardware acceleration kicked in, we lost about 25% of the battery life. The reason was when you throw the GPU in, it starts to consume battery. but again, we were able to get it to full frame, so somebody would be able to watch through the movie completely without having any less than optimal viewing experience. And then interestingly, if we put RTSP on there, again without flash, we dropped about anywhere from 15 to 40% of the battery just for playing something that was playing on a built-in protocol. And then lastly, we found that the dual-core equipped devices, like the Zoom and the Atrix, surprisingly had a lower overall battery loss than the devices that didn't have dual cores. So a single core machine or handset was having to work harder. Its battery would tend to drop faster than a dual core machine just because it had extra processing and intended to balance between the cores. And the Atrix, which was the handset that had the dual core in it, had absolutely stellar performance, but it would heat up to the point where it was almost too hot to hold in your hand. I don't know if anybody used the old power books. They used to heat up so much that if you wore shorts, they would like make your legs turn red, and you could actually flip them over and put an egg on it, and it would fry the egg after about 15 minutes. So just a quick summary on that, without getting too much into the HTML5 flash debate. We found that the major issue that we were running into was the inconsistency of the operating system and the underlying services to be able to deliver a consistent user experience. And yesterday at the Content Delivery Summit, without being prompted, the gentleman from Reuters walked up to me and said that exact same thing. He said, we find that we have, as we deliver to Android devices, there's so many variations out there that we can't guarantee that we can deliver to all of those devices short of using some form of plug-in on the device, whether it's Flash Player or something else. That fact there is one of the key selling points for iOS devices. We may not like the fact that they're not really open, but they consistently work. They either consistently work beautifully or they don't work at all. So it's a binary where in Android it may work, it may not work, sort of work. And then we just found it amazing that the Nexus S couldn't run all the content without Flash plugin, the Flash Player plugin. So Flash Player provides us with a consistent experience with a minimal battery impact. What are the implications for HTML5 on Android, and specifically with H.264 delivery, not WebM? If the core services variations are such that they're either substandard or broken, we think this is significant as we go forward because while it's true that RTSP and RTMP aren't going to be used as much in the future, right now they're heavily used, especially for desktop, and if they provide the same consistent experience on Android, content owners will probably require people to use the Flash version with RTMP. And I think that that's going to be the case even for the next year or so. I'm not particularly keen on that. Like Dom said in the last session, Adobe's doing a lot of work with HTML5, but overall it's not there yet. And then more importantly is the question of whether Google's going to actually come back and refork Android completely. If you read through the rights that they have with WebM as well as with Android, there's a very good possibility. What they say is we're holding a separate version in-house, we're forking it ourselves, and we can choose at any point to put that back out into the marketplace. So it's possible, and I don't know whether it's probable, but it's very possible that within the next 6 to 8 months, Google may come back and say to the handset manufacturers, this is the version of 2.3, 3.1, et cetera, that you have to use so that we get consistency across the handsets out there. I think the experimentation that's happened has been absolutely phenomenal. But I think Google, if they're going to want to provide a consistent user experience, is going to have to rein it in. So I'm not going to say that that's my prediction, but I think that there's a very good possibility that'll happen. And then this last piece at the bottom, workflow.blogspot.com, you can go there and you can actually find the reports in their very gory detail. I guess we've got just a few minutes. Does anybody have questions? Who in the room is actually delivering video to Android devices now? And are you delivering to, is anybody delivering to more than, say, 15 devices that you know of? 10 devices? Platform? Yeah, right, okay. So, and are you finding that you're having consistency problems?
We're having consistency problems just, for instance, the same Samsung devices will vary between Galaxy S and Galaxy S2.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
It's just not going to play the same video.
Right, right.
Saying you look at Nexus S or HTC,
Mm-hmm.
not going to play the same video.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that's what boggles my mind, that within the same handset manufacturer, they're not using the same versions of the stack. I mean, I understand why when you have a newer device with a newer processor, but still at the end of the day, you know, measure them against themselves in-house before you put them out into the wild. So it's interesting to hear you're having the same problems. Any questions? All right, great. Thank you all.